Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, your host who does the intro exactly the same every time and will never change. And I am joined by Greg, who puts up with it because I'm his friend, probably. Greg, how angry are you every time that I introduce this show?
I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed. All right. And first of all, please don't put that out there on the internet that we're friends. I do not co-sign this. I do not want that out there. It's another great week. Hey, Fires of Heaven. It just keeps going. I'm interested to see what we have to talk about this week, but I thought it was very funny that we spoke a lot last week about this would be a satisfying place to leave these characters if that's where they wanted to leave these characters. And surprise, they didn't. No. He didn't. We're just going to continue on and talk through some logistics of politics in a small village.
Yeah. This was a very odd chapter this week because I simultaneously felt like I learned a lot of new things and there were things for me to kind of think about and puzzle over. And at the same time, I don't know that I would call it in any way action-packed, right? It felt like things moved forward, but somehow it felt slow, even though it all happened over the course of 20 pages. Maybe it's just they were small things that added up instead of one big moment, but it did feel kind of like an anticlimax and a big leap forward simultaneously to me.
Well, and I think part of that is, as we expected, it's the characters are getting reined in so much. So it's like the momentum we were feeling with these characters growing and changing and becoming cool heroes. It's like, they're being told to slow their roll and to come back to the homestead. And I feel like that's frustrating them. And because we're so aligned with them, it's frustrating to us because I don't know why I'm using we. I was excited that they were growing and changing. And now it's like, okay, back to where you used to be. And I see the dramatic tension and the power in that. But I am not sure that it's going to make for good reading. So before we go any further, let me just remind listeners, in case you opened up the wrong file, that this episode is Chapter 50, To Teach and Learn. It is just one chapter. Has to rank among the longest single chapters we've looked at, I think, in this series so far. And we focus on Nynaeve, Elayne, and their arrival at Salidara.
Saladar, because it's not the rhyme anymore. Saladar is the name of the city. But yeah, I think this is an interesting one, and I'm excited to dive in because there are 8 million little details here. The one thing that I do just want to note for people, I am going to do my best to keep this summary relatively short. I am avoiding going into too many details because this is actually a fascinating chapter as a rereader. There are a lot of first-time hints at things that will happen later on that if you are really paying attention, I think are worth looking at and digging into, but there's no way for me to highlight them without being like, look at this interesting thing here. It's going to predict something later on. So if you want to Sherlock Holmes it, this is a great chapter to Sherlock Holmes. There are 8 million times that you can say, why did the Aes Sedai say that? Was it because they can't lie, and what are they hiding? Every single word out of someone's mouth in this chapter is meaningful. I'm going to give you what I can. Any thoughts on what I am not able to say or what you may have missed before I dive into a probably very long summary?
I'm going to give you what I can. I think that was your marriage vow, wasn't it? Yeah, I think that was. That was all you promised. All right. Now, having insulted your wife on a podcast episode she'll never listen to, I will say, Tylor, hit us with that long summary full of details we may or may not care about someday.
Nynaeve sweats as she worries about the Aes Sedai discussing her and Elayne behind a shield of air. Their belongings are all laid out in front of them, and they apparently began telling their story before they were stopped and brought before Sheriam's group of Aes Sedai. Siwan and Lyanna are now there as well, and Nynaeve is shocked by Lyanna's dress and apparently by her enormous amount of self-confidence. Nynaeve begins studying the wound that was apparently left by stilling, but as soon as she starts to reach for the power, she is chided by Sheriam for forgetting the ways of the tower and for not listening to the instructions she was given earlier. The Aes Sedai say they bring troubling news and troubling items with them. They are apparently shocked by the Adam and say that it must be studied, especially if Elayne is correct in saying that she can produce ter'angreal. Siwan says that she had no knowledge of Varen giving the girls the dream ter'angreal, and she says that she has questions for Varen. Siwan is forced to defend giving the girls their basically get out of jail free card, and the girls say that they have proved themselves worthy of the trust that she put in them, but the Aes Sedai more or less kind of disregard it and say even though they achieved much, it was unreasonable, and Siwan says there was no need for her to tell the Aes Sedai of her plans with the girls until it turned out that they were alive, and then she suggests spying on Elaida using the ring and Teleron Riode, and also using it to keep in touch with Egwene and Rand, and the Aes Sedai say it will be very valuable to be able to speak with Egwene. Sheriam declares Nynaeve and Elayne must teach the Aes Sedai how to use the Dream ter'angreal, and the Aes Sedai claim more or less all of their money after they do this, and then also they decide that the girls cannot be held at fault for any of the things that they've done, and so they will resume their time and training as accepted. The girls are told to take their jewels and to cooperate with Siwan and Lyanna as best they can, and they are told to leave their adventuring behind them. Bianin, one of the Aes Sedai, changes the subject to the seal of the Dark One's prison, which apparently was broken sometime during the trip to Saladar. Despite it being Quendiar, all of the Aes Sedai are baffled, and some of them even insist that it could not possibly be Quendiar because Quendiar does not break. We also learn that at current counting, there are only 3 more seals of the Dark One's prison, and everyone is worried that may not be enough. When the girls eventually exit, they get to the common room where there is a crowd gathering and waiting for them. Tom apparently is entertaining Merrigan's boys, and Brigitte was clearly terrified that the Aes Sedai would ask about her and her origins, but Elayne assures her that that has not happened. Min is thrilled to see them until Elayne says that she wants to speak with her specifically, and that seems to take all of the enthusiasm out of Min. At this point, Faolain arrives, needling Nynaeve about being a wilder, and they start to tease Faolain about something that happened in Sheriam's study before she says that she has changed and has done nothing since then, and then she addresses the two of the women with them, Nicola and Irena, telling them to come with her, and she reveals that they are now testing older women to potentially be accepted or novices, and they have so far found 3 of them. Tom, Julian, and Uno insist on talking to Nynaeve and Elayne alone, and they eventually tell the girls that this camp is full of deluded Aes Sedai who have no hope of unseating Elaida, and they suggest fleeing entirely. Elayne immediately rejects the idea, and Nynaeve eventually does so, thinking about the value of learning healing from all of the Aes Sedai here. The girls try to convince the men to leave without them, but all of them now have excuses for why they cannot leave until sometime later, and it becomes clear to the girls that they are staying to protect them. Nynaeve is both frustrated by this and appreciates the support. At this point, Siwan and Lyanna emerge from the other room, and Gareth Brine joins the group as well. Elayne greets him, noting that there is a rift now between him and her mother, and telling him to go and heal that rift, and he completely ignores her. He addresses Uno, asking whether the Shinarans would be willing to help train his soldiers, and Uno agrees. Tom and Gareth Brine then kind of talk around the fact that they clearly know each other, and Brine invites him to play a game of stones, and he eventually agrees. He criticizes Siwan's ability to wash his shirts, and then and at this point, Julian seems to be glad that he was not included in Brine's interest, and everyone leaves except for the girls. Elayne seems upset that Brine ignored her, but then says she must speak to Min and hurries off. Siwan is very sharp and very direct when talking to Nynaeve, and sends Merrigan after Theodrin to find rooms, and then Siwan demands that Nynaeve help her, and after confirming that a woman who cannot channel can use the ring to enter Teleron Riod, she demands that Nynaeve teach her how to use the ring. Siwan admits that the Aes Sedai don't know about this, but then she blackmails Nynaeve into not telling anyone, because claiming that she knows that Nynaeve posed as a full sister in her travels, and that would not be considered acceptable by Sheriam and others. Nynaeve reluctantly agrees, but argues that in return, she needs to be able to study Siwan, Lyanna, and Logain to determine if stilling can be healed. Siwan pauses before accepting, but eventually she does agree, commenting that she hopes Moraine has kept Egwene more influenceable than Nynaeve has become. We then switch into Elayne's point of view as she catches up to Min and observes that Lyanna is apparently flirting with a man who is giving her some information. Min is doing Gareth Brine's laundry, and she apparently knew that Elayne would stay, but says that was not a vision, and then she says she would have left with them if they had gone. Min says that she caught an aura from the group of Ariana, Nicola, and Merrigan, and apparently they are trouble. Elayne asks Min about her viewing of Rand and Elayne, and Min says that Elayne will love Rand, and he is tied to her in some way, but Min has not seen a viewing to definitively confirm that Rand will love Elayne. Min then says that Elayne will have to share Rand with two others and admit that she is one of the two. Elayne is shocked and asks who the third is, and all Min knows is that she is someone with a temper. Min says that she wants to be Elayne's friend, and Elayne says that she doesn't like the idea of sharing. Neither does Min, but Min then admits that she will do so if she has to. Elayne says that it must be Ta'Viren tying them all up around Rand, and then she resolves to, quote, work it out with Min and also with the third person, but then immediately starts worrying about who that third person could be. Min then starts to worry aloud about what type of woman it might be, specifically highlighting Kyrian and noble women, and Elayne assures her that Avienda is looking out for him for them, and Elayne then channels to help Min with her chores, even though it's not strictly allowed, and Elayne asks Min for the details of what is going on with Siwan and Lyanna, and Min begins to tell the entire story, while Elayne thinks that Avienda had better be looking after Rand, and boy is she. Greg, what did you think about this chapter? We've already kind of spoken in general terms. What would you say are the one or two moments that stood out to you? Because there are a lot of little things in this chapter and not really one big through line.
I think when we had been here with this group before, I kind of cast them as the resistance movement, and it felt like a kind of positive step that they were getting a commander for their armies, and they're going to build it all up. And I think a lot of the small moments here confirmed that this is kind of an area building power and a group building power, and I liked kind of having that confirmed and hearing some of those small details about how many men are gathered, how they are, struggling to find resources, kind of all those basic things. So then what surprised me the most probably is that it doesn't feel like they're unified in any way whatsoever. Yeah. It feels like basically everybody we encounter hates everybody else we encounter. And, that makes for a good book, but it makes me worried for this group of people in terms of creating a fighting force of any kind.
Yeah, and I think a real highlight of that is just the very, very first moment in the chapter. We learned that Nynaeve and Elayne arrived, they started talking to someone, they were told, be quiet, and then very oddly, they were brought before Sheriam and 5 other Aes Sedai. The reason I say that is odd is because at the beginning of this book, Siwan advised them, what are you doing? Form a Hall of the Tower so you have someone to oppose Elaida. It appears they either have not accomplished that in the several months since that conversation occurred, or Sheriam and her little group are still running things even though there is a Hall of the Tower. And either one of those, I think, highlights exactly what you're describing. This is an unorganized mess that really doesn't have much leadership, even though it seems like Sheriam is as close as it gets.
Yeah, an unorganized mass without a leader that shrugs into whoever seems to be in charge. That sounds oddly familiar. Yeah, right? So I do find that like good writing in that it is compelling and it is natural, right? Because I do think when you have, a kind of this sense of danger coming and that you need to be united and that, they've survived this big threat of the Black Aja and Elida kind of separately taking over. What you survive all that, and it's like, yes, we all hate them, but that doesn't mean you necessarily agree on what this means. And I think the larger, messier picture of the politics of this region, it's like, well, just because we all want to regain the White Tower doesn't necessarily mean we want to support Rand now and 10 other choices in the mix on that.
Well, and I think the really interesting thing then is trying to figure out what is Sheriam's motivation and what are the motivations of these other Aes Sedai, right? Because as you say, they are not acting as one. They very much have different concerns. And so while it's difficult for me to pull out all of the 6 Aes Sedai in this conversation, I don't know if they're all named. I don't think they all have big moments. There are really interesting tensions where some of them want to be talking about the seals and others don't. And some of them are very concerned about the girls' behavior, and others of them clearly just want to dismiss it and tell them to just kind of get going. And so that kind of lots of different viewpoints in one cluster, I thought was really well done in the writing. I never felt like there was a direction to the conversation, which is a little frustrating, but it's how those kind of like meetings by committee end up working 99% of the time, and it feels really accurate.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. They are in such crisis mode triage that they don't have time to stop and have the discussion any one of those issues needs to have, and they don't share that united front to do so. So it just keeps like carrying on to the next thing. And, that is so much of the committee work I'm in where it's like, actually I had a committee meeting this week and it was like, great, we have nothing. And then half an hour, these 3 major proposals arrived and it's like, oh, well, it's almost like you didn't want us to think about these and so on. So, it just is kind of natural to a bureaucratic organization. And this goes back to your question of the leadership of this group. It's also true that, like, when you are a part of a bureaucracy and it breaks down, you kind of naturally try to rebuild what you had, but it's not what you should be rebuilding, right? You should be creating something leaner and meaner, and in this case, it might be a singular leader to stand behind and just kind of do what that person says. Not that I'm here in whatever week this is arguing for autocracy, but, I do think that there is a benefit in a situation like this to having a clear direction instead of that kind of pure democracy. Everybody gets to voice their concern. Yeah, I'm going to stop that line of conversation now. I'm scared.
Well, and I think what's so fascinating about this is you are right to say, like, in times of crisis, we kind of need to centralize leadership. And what's so fascinating is Siwan did exactly that, and it was her downfall, right? And so these are characters who are both seeing the crisis and are trying to learn the lesson of the person who came behind them, who did literally everything behind closed doors and no one knew what was going on, right? And part of the problem that creates is what we learn about in this chapter. Siwan apparently was giving orders and then not able to even track down what was being done with them. Varen apparently more or less went rogue and gave a ter'angreal to the girls that Siwan didn't know existed, much less was being given to them. And that is interesting in terms of the conversation we're having about what does it look like when every Aes Sedai is kind of a country to themselves and can choose whatever policies they want. But also, I am constantly on Varen watch, and what in the world was her motivation in giving the girls a ter'angreal when all of the Black Aja apparently had dream ter'angreal? That's really interesting to try to go back 2 books and try to figure out what she was thinking and doing.
And, I, for some reason, when you ask that question, I'm like, well, but she must have had a good motivation, even though everything you're saying is like red flag, red flag, red flag. It's like, I think I'm still in a place where I assume Varen, Siwan, and Moraine are like the secret invincible. But when you see that there were even serious divisions, particularly here between Siwan and Varen, then that's a problem because, even if they both think they're doing the right thing, one of them has to be wrong in some regard.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think what's so interesting is Siwan did not know about the Dream ter'angreal. And that becomes immediately apparent because the second she hears about it, she schemes. She is the first one to realize you can use it for spying. She is the first one to realize you can use it for long-distance communication. She's the first one to think, hey, if I'm the one doing this, maybe there's an advantage to it, as opposed to the Aes Sedai who clearly want to pass it on to someone else because it's a chore. This, I think, is one of our first opportunities to see Siwan really in, like, competent mode. We've seen her so much overwhelmed and then overthrown. It's really nice to see her, even if not truly in a position of power, kind of wielding her mind to get everything she can out of every drop of information these girls have brought.
Well, and just to say what you said in a different way, I think so much of her in the first part of this book was kind of back-footed, reacting to things because she'd been overwhelmed, as you just said. And so to see that, like, she spent the months not being idled. And, you know, I thought there were a few moments that showed that she's adjusting to this new life she has, having lost the power. And, you know, and then, like you said, there's some good scheming later on where it's like, oh, wait, do you think somebody who didn't have the power could use this Terra Angreal? And, you know, I was at first like, who's she worried about? And I was like, oh, of course, she's thinking of herself and wanting to get involved still and be a part of it.
Yeah, no, and I think that kind of, the Aes Sedai have this very interesting thing where they are so concerned with power that once they think you don't have it, they ignore you. And that's how it seems like Accepted are able to sneak away in the middle of the night. It's how like Siwan is able to manipulate them so effectively, clearly, into doing a lot of the things that she wants to do and getting the power that she's interested in. And then I think a version of that I found really interesting in this chapter is there's a moment where Bianin changes the conversation to specifically be about the Seals of the Dark One's prison. And this happens right after Sheriam tells them to go. And it is very clear none of the Aes Sedai are even aware the girls are still in the room listening to that conversation until after one of them speaks up. And that kind of carelessness is really scary from a group this powerful.
I thought that was a very peculiar moment, and I think careless was one reading of it, and then also just like it was so far beyond them that the Accepted wouldn't just listen and leave the room immediately, which, you know, shows a kind of carelessness in a different regard, but also is to me was a kind of an eye-opening, like, oh, our girls are going to get humbled. And again, is Nynaeve at rock bottom watch continues, because it feels like she's got further down to go now, because in addition to all the other humbling she's had, she now has to, and she resigns herself. She makes the choice, as you said in your summary, that she's going to stay and try to be that humble so that she can learn the healing skills and hopefully be a part of what's to come. But man, does that mean she's going to continue to be frustrated and totally angry all the time for at least another book, it seems like.
And I think as you're saying that, at the end of the chapter, Min has a really incredible line where she says something like, I knew both you and Nynaeve would stay. Elayne, you did it because you've always been dedicated to this and you're so ambitious. Nynaeve is exactly the same way, but she'll never admit it to herself. And seeing that line from the outside after watching Nynaeve grapple for all of 3 seconds and then decide, I want to be able to heal, this is what I want, no question. Like, I thought it was interesting to see Min knows Nynaeve better than Nynaeve does at this point, which I think you're right means she's definitely not hit rock bottom yet.
Well, and I did like I also clocked that detail of like I just knew it without a vision, and I think that's a fun way to play with Min as a character, that she is just, you know, also a savvy, smart woman, not just clairvoyant.
Yeah, I think the fascinating thing about that character is she now knows so much from her visions that I think she pays attention to everything else to see whether it's confirming one of her visions, and that just makes her really observant, and that's really useful as a character. The next section of this chapter is what I call the check-in with everyone section. We get like a Tom moment and a Merrigan moment and a Birgitta moment and a little Min moment, and like everyone, including Faolain, somehow comes back and gets a shout out. which of these character moments stood out to you? Was there anything that like especially interested you, or was this the kind of skim through it, we're just catching up section of the chapter?
Some of that latter, for sure, if I'm being honest, because it did feel like just wanting. Well, we didn't really signal it, but it was a kind of surprising time jump at the beginning. That again, if the last chapter was not the end of their story, it felt like we'd get some of that journey, and then it's just like the yada yada yada, the kind of road adventure, and then it's like we're here, let's deal with this. So I felt like this section became necessary with the yada 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 of like who made it through the journey and who's still here and is making it. And then that second component of who's going to hang out and continue on here. It seems like everybody kind of gets the choice to walk away, and they just one by one decide not to walk away. Of all of those, the most interesting to me was Brigitte, because I always don't know exactly how to interpret kind of her demigod status in this particular world, but it felt to me like there's a cabinet meeting and like Paul Bunyan's there or something, and you're like, oh, I guess Paul Bunyan should hang out. You get to be Secretary of the Interior, but so it's kind of like, but in this case, I'm gonna stop the twisted metaphor, but it's like they didn't recognize who she is. It would be dangerous if they did in some ways, and so the fact that they might have this kind of demigod amongst them and not even realize it is interesting to me. Feels like a fuse being lit for later books.
So you jumped to one of two possibilities. I also keyed in on that moment, but for me it was because I wasn't sure what she was freaked out about. Because I think she could be equally potentially freaked out about they will know I am Brigitte and all of the kind of legacy and stuff that comes along with that. Or it could be I was concerned that they would know that I am a warder and women are not allowed to be warders, and that could be its own problem, right? And I think just all of the layers to that, you're exactly right to highlight. That is a fascinating dangling thread for us to be playing around with going forward, because you're accurate, right? The last time we saw Brigitte do something in battle, it was sinking ships after the Horn of Valir had been blown, but I don't know that she can do that now. She just seems good with a bow, and so figuring out the limits of that and what it means, I think her kind of panic really sold how important that will be going forward.
Yeah, and so then since I highlighted that one, I will just say the men all felt to me like we just had to check off that they all had an out and chose to stay, and we got different reasons for that. There was a little, ran so far away, I don't think I can make that journey. But it felt like, in reality, they all really like Nynaeve and Elayne and don't want to end this companionship. They don't want to break this fellowship.
Yeah, I really loved the moment where they were all like, we must leave tonight. You will all die if we don't leave tonight. And the girls are like, no, we're staying. And they're like, okay, we can't possibly leave tonight. It would be absurd for us to do that. Like, that is a moment that both kind of speaks true. And I think kind of rings true. And as you're saying, it speaks to this idea that those characters really no longer are here. I think Nynaeve says, like, don't do this for Rand. Don't do this because Lan told you had to. And all of them say, it's not that. I just want to. And I think that kind of really speaks to the fact that you're right. This is a closer relationship than all of Nynaeve's POVs would lead us to believe. And that isn't completely surprising, knowing what we know about Nynaeve. The other moment in this kind of section that really stood out to me was apparently a change in Aes Sedai policy. Faolain shows up, and she takes away two of the three women that have been kind of accumulating around them. She takes Nicola and Irena, and when she takes them, she says that they will be tested to be novices, which would not have been possible. It's worth would not have been possible previously. It's worth noting Nynaeve at, I guess, like 19 or so was considered far too old to take the test to be a novice, and she was only allowed to because she was the most powerful woman on record. These women don't seem to have that level of power and are probably in their mid-20s, and they're both being taken in with open arms, which they say they've only found 3 others so far, but that policy change is really interesting as we're thinking about what is this kind of new tower and how is it different from the old one.
Well, we're 28 minutes in, and I haven't made a pop culture reference, which has to be some kind of record. So I will say what came to mind is the scene in the Two Towers where the riders of Rohan are preparing to man the fort, and you just see this part of a montage where they give like a helmet to an incredibly old man and are like, go out there, and then they hand a spear to like a small cherubic boy, like, go, son, and like, the ways in which that signals desperation. I thought this was exactly that, right? It's like, we can't be picky and choosy anymore, and we have to, fill our ranks and increase our number just to have a shot at what we need to achieve. So we'll take all comers, and we're going to get desperate. And yeah, you don't have much talent, but we'll work with it. We'll get you there. Hey, that's sometimes how I feel hiring, right? Like, hey, I'll take what I can take at this point. Yeah.
That is absolutely valid. I have been on academic hiring committees, and sometimes you're like, yep, you're the one who could stand up and talk. I thought that Gareth Brine was kind of a breath of fresh air for these characters. We've been getting kind of the same conflicts and Nynaevisms and all of those things over and over again. So to see Gareth Brine kind of put Elayne off of her balance, she doesn't know what to do with him, especially when he ignores her. And then to see Tom and him kind of do the dance of, hey, aren't you the guy who I was supposed to murder 20 years ago because you betrayed the woman who I eventually became lovers with? No, we're just going to ignore that. And I thought that was just a really fun moment.
Yeah, I mean, the two men were my favorite of those two. It was so much like, two barnyard animals sniffing around each other and like puffing out their chests and seeing where they could go. But I really liked that they kind of settle on, well, but we could play games together every night. And it's like, yep, we could. Let's just do that. And boy, does that sound like it would work for me. That's literally our relationship, right? We could fight it out, or let's just get together and play games sometimes because nobody else wants to be around us.
You have just described every one of my friendships in exact detail. The only other note that I have... No, the next thing I want to do is jump to Siwan and Nynaeve and their understanding that they come to. I found this to be a really interesting section because I have never seen Nynaeve quite so willing to play the game as she is here, and it really surprised me, right? Siwan blackmailing Nynaeve, nothing shocking there. Nynaeve blackmailing Siwan back really surprised me.
I mean, it's certainly a fun moment, and that is the kind of dynamic that is going to make for another great kind of source of conflict in books to come, right? That kind of mutually assured destruction, essentially. And so I also found that delicious.
The last note there, Nynaeve multiple times in this chapter has a new interest that we had not seen before. She is very curious about stilling and wants to understand what the wound of stilling looks like and whether it is possible to heal stilling. And this is something that we have just been flat out told is impossible up to this point. What are your thoughts on this new interest of Nynaeve's?
I'll say this vaguely for people who don't trust cross the channels, but there are major stilling events in the TV show that I would like to see fixed. And so I was like, maybe we're just seeing that those events can be fixed in kind of out of order, right? That maybe this is the start of a pathway towards that. So, I mean, in a period where seemingly all of our major characters are like a new once-in-a-generation talent who has abilities heretofore unforeseen, then, it just seems like, oh, okay, she's going to learn how to heal stilling, and that could be awesome, right? I think, imagining, rightfully returning Siwan's powers to her and letting her do all this scheming we're seeing Ambi back in charge feels worth it. So who else? Like Logain, right? Like there have been other candidates that could be empowered.
Absolutely. Any last thoughts on the Nynaeve POV before I switch over to Elayne? I think we've hit all of my major points.
Not ready to say, because I was so wrong last time, that this is where we leave her, but certainly, again, starts to feel like we're laying down more road for the future than we are kind of completing a story. It does.
Yeah.
My joke at the beginning of the episode is how it feels. It's like her story just keeps going on, even though it doesn't feel like it has a clear trajectory. So,
yeah,
if this is where we leave her, interested to see where those develop in the future.
Actually, this brings me back. I was listening to our episode from 2 weeks ago this morning because that's how I work. And I heard at one point in the episode, I said, we're going to talk about how this chapter is like a Greta Gerwig movie. And then we never came back to it and did it. Nynaeve's scenes remind me a lot of Lady Bird, where it's like, here is a scene that's really well done. And then here is another scene that's really well done. And then here is another scene that's really well done. And do they really form a plot? No. They're just scenes about the same characters doing different things. But they kind of form a really wonderful movie, even though there isn't a through line all of the time. That's kind of how I feel about this plot for Nynaeve. We are getting these like little glimpses in, and sometimes I feel like we're skipping some of the pieces that would be really important. And I'm really curious, as you're saying at the end of this book, how much are we going to skip? Right? Because that's the interesting thing with Robert Jordan. He often doesn't have gaps in the middle of his books, but between, I'm now starting to wonder kind of how much off-screen development are we going to see in this plot line.
Well, and that's certainly a fair point. I think we're sensing that Perrin has had a lot of development off between his last appearance and hopefully next book, one would assume. But I think that is
chapters are just him.
I do think that's an interesting question, and a good friend of ours who doesn't listen to the podcast, so I don't have to be that nice, is really obsessed with the Expanse books, and that to me is baffling. They're okay, but they're not great works of literature in my mind. Sorry, Expanse fans, but there was a time where suddenly that series just jumped way further ahead than it had been, and I felt totally like ripped off because I'm like, no, I've been like living day to day with these characters. I don't want to suddenly miss out on, I forget if it was 10 or 20 years. And then, I found myself struggling to appreciate the character growth and change. And they're like, I've suffered so much. I'm like, wait, did you? Well, wait, yeah, I guess you suffered way more than I thought because it wasn't on screen. So that in general, I use the Expanse reference to say that's something I struggle with as a reader, that I kind of, if I'm locked into a character, I really want to be there with them. So if we do get a time gap, I will be interested to see how that changes my mood.
Yeah, I have to say, this book is a missed opportunity. How in the world do we only get one circus scene in the circus book? Like, I'm still a little mad about it. Elayne's POV gives us some very specific details on things that we have gotten kind of vague hints at for books and books and books, right? So we now have pretty much the entirety, I think, of Min's viewing laid out, right? Rand will be loved by 3 women. He will be tied to those 3 women. He may or may not love them back. Elayne is one of those women. Min is one of those women. There is a 3rd woman who has a temper, and boy, do I know an Aiel lady with quite the temper.
I know an Aiel lady with a temper. I know an evil Forsaken lady with a temper. I know a former Wisdom from the Two Rivers with a temper. Like, not that I really think it will be Nynaeve, but we've used the analogy before about how like a Doctor Who season has a big bad at the end that you get a little tidbit for at the end, and this felt like that. It's like, okay, you've been patient as we've let these mysteries simmer. Let's just give a little here to satisfy, and it did feel concrete and a way forward. I'm gonna just go ahead and assert that I still don't think it's Avienda, because everything out in the Aiel Waste, in Carrion now, feels like she ended that relationship, and yes, it could be that she continues on not as the romantic third, but as a third party that they all contend with. But I was leaning more towards Lanfear this time for whatever reason.
Yeah, we will leave that 3rd one up because there is no evidence of who it is at this point. Other than that revelation, though, really what I got here is it turns out that the girls that were brought along, Arena and Nicola, and also Merrigan, who isn't a girl, she's much older. They are trouble, according to Min. And I know that you had largely ignored those characters, but when you get a flashing red light like this, we've got to at least briefly mention it. It seems like Min is not visioning as much as she had in the past. We didn't get like the 80, different things flickering around different characters much this book, but this feels pretty meaningful, as does how I think the moment when Elayne describes how tied up she feels in this prophecy and in Ta'Viren was really telling. And so anytime that Min kind of flashes anything, I immediately zero in on it.
I mean, not to use my old cliches, but I was like, stop trying to make these girls a thing. But I did feel like the kind of clear warning sign coupled with the we're going to take these girls in even though they're not what we would usually take as a good candidate, that just rang my Star Wars prequel bells, right? Like, we don't want to train Anakin. We don't want to train Anakin. Okay, we'll train Anakin. Uh-oh, right? So, like, It just felt like that same kind of structure, which is not unique to Star Wars. It's kind of a mythological trope of you take on the student you shouldn't take on, and turns out you shouldn't have taken on that student. So it felt like that kind of classic structure.
If you're not allowed to take the, classic story of mythic archetypes and describe it as originating in 1977, what's the point of even doing film criticism? I don't understand.
Who knows when we're recording, but I will say the movie Heretic that came out with Hugh Grant, he does an amazing job telling the Bible story in vague terms to these two they are Mormon girls that he's torturing, and he's like, do you love that story? And they're like, yes. And he's like, that's the Phantom Menace. And then he's like, you think Jar Jar Binks is scripture? And just to hear Hugh Grant in the year of our Lord 2024 say Jar Jar Binks in a movie made amazing. My life. But yes, that is kind of the point. Like, we just see these things in their modern incarnations, but they speak to those kind of Joseph Campbell archetypal type things.
So at the end of this chapter, I've got two very minor notes. I don't know if you have anything to say about them. One is that both Min and Elayne seem not enthused, but resigned to sharing Rand, right? Both of them seem to make peace with it and say that they are going to work it out. The other note that I have at the end of this chapter is Robert Jordan, 3 times, really wants us to laugh at how confident Elayne is that Avienda is keeping Rand safe and not at all sleeping with him. I don't know whether that joke is worthy of comment, but it's at least worth asking if you have a comment.
I mean, I giggled, right? Not much else to comment in other than it worked. Yeah.
So, if that's what we've got for this chapter as a whole, next week we have some big reading coming up. My note says long AF, which I assume means as Faolain. We will be reading Chapter 51, News Comes to Cairhien, and Chapter 52, Choices, which combined are just about 100 words longer than any reading we've had on this podcast before. So please make sure you leave yourself a little bit of extra time, but we've only got 3 weeks left, and so the fact that this is long, I think, is telling that we're either ramping up or it's going to be the beginning of the end, even if that's a slow end. What are you anticipating, Greg? I think we've said for the last 4 or 5 weeks, this feels like it could be the end for these characters. We said that with Rand and co. We said that now here, and we've said it multiple times here. What do you think we've got? There's still almost 100 pages, maybe more than 100 pages of this book left. What are you anticipating?
You busted me for what I was just flipping in my book for. So we are just shy of 100 left in my edition, which is the mass market paperback. So we've got 110 or 108 left in my edition. So let's go, right? Because where I'm at on this book is I don't think it's got another big climax in it. So I'm just let's dwindle down and lay the track for everything to come. I guess what I'm expecting in the last 3 weeks, I'm not necessarily saying next week, is something that, again, would make somebody back in the 90s say, I can't wait till the next book comes out. So I think there's going to be a revelation or a cliffhanger of some kind that's going to be like, I got to get the next one. I'm not going to give that up. And so kind of the doldrums we've experienced since the big battle feels like it's going to need that kind of punch to make it so that you really want to keep reading. So that's my hypothesis. That's what I'm hoping for.
Will there be another climax in this book? I know. Greg doesn't. And you can find out, well, a third of the way next time through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.